Great, welcome to this online tutorial. This is all a bit strange for us. We've been spending a term working online. We've got a bit better at it, but we wanted to give you some sense how we would teach English at Hertford. So we're going to introduce ourselves first, and I'm going to say a bit about what we're trying to do in this tutorial. So my name's Emma Smith. I teach mostly Shakespeare and Renaissance literature to second and third years at Hertford, but for first years I usually teach the Introduction to Criticism module, which is a compulsory sort of toolkit type module that we do in the second term of the first year. And I'm going to, today we've got just about 15 minutes. We're going to do an example of about 15 minutes based on some reading that these guys have been doing, and the reading is about ideas of authorship and how much the author matters in literary study. So first thing I'm going to ask them to do is to introduce themselves. Jaya, do you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Jaya. I'm a first year English student at Hertford, and I was just going to give you a brief summary of what I do to prepare for a tutorial usually. So normally you get set a certain amount of reading or an essay to complete, and your tutors will mark that in preparation of the tutorial, and the tutorial will be structured around the feedback to your essay. And normally I say, yeah, it's a few hours of reading preparation, and it's nothing to be stressed about. It's just a conversation, really.
Brilliant, thanks, Jaya. Rosanna, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I'm Rosanna. I'm obviously also a first year student at Hertford. And yeah, what I get most from tutorials is, I think it's a good way to kind of like strengthen your arguing skills, like, and that kind of transfers over to your essays as well, like being able to have, you kind of find, like, I guess in a sense, a critical voice in a tutorial a bit, because you have to try and be able to support your own ideas, and that transfers well over to an essay. So yeah, that's what I get out of tutorials.
Brilliant. Jesse.
I'm Jesse, still a first year student at Hertford. So normally to prepare for tutorials, I would lock myself in the library for a good number of hours and go through. Most of the time we've got an essay to write beforehand, like Jaya said, and then we center the discussion around them.
Brilliant. Yeah. So we haven't got essays. We haven't got essays today to talk through. But what we have got is some shared reading, and we picked the reading because we thought it might be a bit more understandable to people who haven't had the chance to do all the reading. So we picked Roland Barthes' 1967 essay, "The Death of the Author," as a way into thinking about debates about authorship, sort of biographical interpretations, the changing how important authors are, or readers are in thinking about literature. So we're going to just talk about that for around, talk about the reading, I guess, for around 10 minutes, and then we're going to discuss a couple of more specific examples. So we're going to make what's quite an abstract argument in a way a little bit more concrete and see how it works on some literary texts. So I was thinking, maybe I'll just throw open this question to everybody. Barthes says that we no longer believe in the kind of author God delivering a single theological meaning. And I wondered if we could just talk a bit about how does Barthes in that essay think about the author? He always gives author a capital A, doesn't he? What kinds of, what does he say about the role of the author with a capital A?
I think he seems to imply that the author is some kind of dictator, and by kind of believing in this idea that the author is central and, you know, their viewpoint goes, we diminish our capacity for, like, critical analysis and, like, having our own opinion and perception of a piece.
I mean, going off the figure of the dictator, like you said, the author with the capital A, which is obviously meant to imitate God with a capital G, he kind of sets up this weird sort of secular religion around the author, that is sort of very monotheistic in a way. So I think
Yeah, it's really funny how you've just introduced that. I suppose it's because of what we're all thinking about right now. It's making me think of a kind of a big oppressive statue that needs to come down, and we need to throw it in the harbour or something. I mean, it's almost that kind of. It feels like that kind of idea, doesn't it? That, and I suppose Bart is writing. I said he's writing it in 1967. He's writing it in an age of student ferment and kind of riots in Paris, and a whole sense that younger people want to overthrow the kind of traditions and the oppressions of their elders. So I guess it's feeding on that more general kind of politics. What do you think about the death of the author then in that case? Is Bart saying we should commit murder, or is he saying let's not give him the kind of, I'm just trying to think about the imagery, let's not give him the lifeblood of caring about him or whatever?
Yeah, I think it's definitely metaphorical. It's not like a Salman Rushdie type thing of like we ought to kill the author because of something they've written. It's more about decentering the author and accepting that the creative process is more than just the writer. It's like the text itself has its own essence, which then kind of filters into our culture and our society. For example, like I'd say with Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, there are certain lines in it like "Don't hang back with the brutes" that have become have gained like cultural significance now, and they kind of exist in and of their own right, detached from the author. And I think that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the text having an existence that is not directly linked to the writer.
That's a really good example, Jay, because he also says that texts are actually a tissue of quotations, doesn't it, or a tissue of references from other writings. They're not. Part of his argument is even that writing is not original, so it doesn't even come from a single author. It comes from something, a more general kind of cultural authorship almost.
The idea of, when I was thinking about this, like the idea of cultural authorship and stuff, it really made me think about the Anglo-Saxon texts we've been doing, with the sort of decentered author figure, because they didn't have the same ascription of the name, and obviously you had the scripter at the same time, and there was this weird cultural interplay that goes on between all the texts.
I think that's a really good example, because like when we're reading the Anglo-Saxon text, I still try and imagine like a writer, like I still build up an image of what I imagine this writer to look like, and like I still kind of read the text through that as if like I can hear like this like strange voice like speaking the text. Like you still always kind of imagine like an image of an author even when it's not been ascribed to the text.
I think what's quite problematic is that even from a young age, the discourse with which like we discuss the content and meaning of a text always surrounded the author. So for example, like as a kid they'd say at school, what did the writer mean by this? It's always very like author-centric, and I feel like that's been ingrained in us from a young age, and now we're trying to move away from that and say that there are meanings in a text which aren't necessarily linked to the author. So you can read something like I don't know, Animal Farm, and obviously we know that it has its roots in a specific event, but you can relate it to other events in your own life and kind of your own understanding of the world, and I think that's equally important.
Yeah, sometimes I think one of the reasons Shakespeare's works have been so open to interpretation is that we know nobody can really go back to Shakespeare and say, well, here's the evidence that said Shakespeare was, a misogynist, or Shakespeare was a political Republican, or any of those things. We just don't have the evidence, and that's been in some ways quite freeing. Although I suppose the paradox is that that's developed its own weird energy of it about who really wrote Shakespeare. So on the one hand, we don't really have a kind of author figure for Shakespeare, and on the other hand, people have been trying to work out, it was really Queen Elizabeth or the Earl of Oxford, and kind of all that weird stuff. I thought the stuff you're saying about the Anglo-Saxons is really interesting, because don't we still say, it's a long time since I've done my Anglo-Saxon, but things like the Pearl author.
Yeah.
So we don't have a name for them, but we're trying. just correct me, I maybe I'll be wrong on this, but is that an attempt to try and aggregate works together into little canons and say this author does this in this text and this in the other text, so the author becomes about a body of, it's not a biographical figure because we don't know anything about them and we don't have a name for them, but we can say, well, they wrote this on the one hand and they also wrote this. Is that what that's trying to do?
When I wrote my dissertation, because I did it on the medieval Catherine group texts, I kind of, the whole way through, I kind of just basically said the imagined writer, but then I also had to talk about the audience that these texts were being used for. And so like the speakers of the text that would like relay them to the audience, I kind of, those figures kind of became the writers in a way, like the people that were speaking these texts. So like I feel like with those texts, because often they're spoken as well as read, like you kind of, like all these other kind of author figures get thrown in because there's like a lot of figures that are having to like read these texts out to different audiences. So I feel like with those texts there are kind of a lot of author figures, I guess, in a way.
I think.
Go, Jesse. Sorry. Keep going.
Not necessarily the Catherine group, but like another layer which often comes up with these old texts is the translator. Whether he's veils the author figure or whether it duplicates it, because like you've got like multiple, like Beowulf, for example. I've seen multiple translations, obviously, but some of them, like Heaney's, are become almost canonical in their own right as a translation, and Heaney almost becomes the author figure that we couldn't quite have before.
That's really interesting, Jesse. No, carry on. You haven't finished.
No,
you were just taking your breath and I was jumping in. Go on.
I was just about to say that some translations don't really ascribe a name so much as they keep the name of the text in major.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting example, isn't it? And is it because Heaney is already a kind of author figure, maybe even with a capital A? So, whereas a kind of academic translator like, I don't know, is it still Richard Hamer or somebody like that, that they're not known as writer figures? I mean, I'm wondering what, one of the things Bart, I think, couldn't really anticipate or take account of is how prominent biographical authors are in our understanding of contemporary literature. So, I mean, there were sort of celebrity authors in the past, like Byron, I guess, or Tennyson or Dickens, or, you know, those people went round and people bought tickets to hear them speak, didn't they? But I mean, now every town and village has a literary festival. Every author of a novel or a kind of non-fiction book goes round talking about it, answering questions about it. And that's a really interesting phenomenon that Bart doesn't take on. I mean, people obviously do want to see the authors because this is the business model that works really well. People will pay, you know, to get a ticket to hear somebody talking about their book. But I suppose we don't necessarily have a sort of theoretical sense how we should use that material. You know, so if the author tells us something about what they meant or what they intended, does that have, what value do you think that would have in interpretation?
Sorry.
Yeah, you go.
I think this is where death of the author becomes quite problematic and quite dangerous, in the way we kind of like deify a writer. So, for example, with someone like J.K. Rowling, because of the name and because of what they've done in the past, we assume that their future work is going to be good and they sell for that reason. You get the same with actors. Like if you see a film that's got, I don't know, Leonardo DiCaprio in, because of his previous successes, you assume it's going to be good. And all of a sudden we start valuing the kind of the fame over the actual quality of the art. And that becomes quite an issue. I think that's why death of the author is quite important.
I think picking up on some of the languages both of you just used, like fame and also what value does it have, thinking about the death of the author as sort of the author figure as kind of a figure of capitalist individualization, like as a figure which is meant to sell. is quite interesting, and the death of the author then becomes sort of almost culturally not Marxist. You know what I'm getting at? It's a upheaval of the individual culture.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that sort of dictator figure or that sort of statue thing that we were thinking about a few minutes ago, you know, that shows that this has got a politics, a kind of larger politics that we could think about. This is such an interesting conversation. I'm just going to share a screen just so that people who are watching us who haven't had a chance to read Bart's article. You can find the article actually online quite easily. So it's called The Death of the Author, and he is Roland Barthes, not in Simpson, but as in Barthes. But let's just look at a couple of examples. I'm just going to share my screen now, and yeah, let's have a look at this one. Can you guys see that? From Sky News earlier this year. I'm just going to move it slightly across. Lee Child, I don't know if anybody's ever read a Lee Child thriller, but Lee Child is absolutely, it's kind of super best-selling author. Lee Child says he will no longer write his world-famous Jack Reacher novels and will be passing on authorship to his brother, Andrew Grant. And then the headline is Lee Child quits Jack Reacher. Jack Reacher is the central hero protagonist in this Lee Child series. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, that's such a weird notion in a way of authorship compared with what we've been talking about.
I think it's really odd the way authorship can be handed down, because there was a similar situation with Agatha Christie's works now being continued by Sophie Hannah, and it's really odd how because the characters are created in the mind of the author, so to hand it over to someone else almost means all the characters are going to be completely reformulated, and I just don't think they are the same characters whatsoever. Because someone that's going on to like a second author to write more about, I don't know, Jack Reacher, will only have an understanding of Jack Reacher through what they have read about Jack Reacher, not about him as an entire character, which only Lee Child has.
I think, in a way, I think it. Sorry, Jessie.
No, please go. You go.
In a way, I think it kind of like refocuses the main thing around the actual language itself, because I guess it's kind of suggesting that you can take the language from the previous novels that were actually written by Lee Child and almost mimic that language to create something new without having the author that actually created it. So it's kind of like distancing Lee Child from it and then like using these materials within those texts to like create something new. So in a way, I think it kind of does, in a way, like distance from the idea of the author as like the dictator almost.
Well, Jaya, what you were saying about the character being created in the mind of the author, you have to question, well, can the character exist in a sense outside of the narrative work? Does it? I mean, you were doing exactly what Barthes warned against by centering the author in this characterization.
I think the character can exist outside of the author, but the author is undeniably the creator of the character. So again, to go back to like Harry Potter as an example, the concept of Harry Potter exists outside of J.K. Rowling because it's become a cultural phenomenon. But at the end of the day, she created him, and only she would, I think, have the authority to determine how he would act in other scenarios. Other people can imagine fanfic, like you can imagine, but it's not quite Harry Potter.
I do think that's entirely.
Yeah. Sorry.
Now you've started on Harry Potter, we've all got something to say. Yeah, go on, Rosanna, you go.
No, I was just gonna say, because I think one of the things that is like most memorable about Harry Potter, I mean, I've actually never read a Harry Potter book, so I'm probably a terrible student, but like, I think the thing that is so significant about those books is how they've kind of been refigured through like fan fictions or whatever, and just like the whole like Harry Potter cult, like all the other ways that they've like these characters have been imagined. Like, what is it J.K. Rowling said recently, like suddenly she's decided that Dumbledore was gay the whole way through the books. Like, I think what is most memorable about those books isn't even just the way that J.K. Rowling wrote them, it's how those characters have kind of been seized upon and refigured in a way by the readers. So in a way, like J.K. Rowling, obviously she's a really controversial figure now, and she is people are saying like, we don't want to, like, let's just kind of forget that she exists now and just focus on the characters in the books. And so I think people have kind of actually weirdly started that process of trying to remove the writer themselves.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take on it, Rosanna. When we're recording this, just as J.K. Rowling has made all kinds of transphobic remarks. I think I'm happy to call it out as that. That's how I experienced what she said, and that is an interesting point, isn't it? When the author, as a biographical figure, does something, says something, aligns themselves with something that we don't like or we don't want to have as part of the fictional world, that is a bit of a challenge for kind of, you know, biographies more generally. We're going to move on because we haven't. We will get a sense of how we could talk about. I think that's a really important thing to talk about. But I've just got one other little screenshot that I want to share with you as an earlier example of something a bit different. I hope everyone can see this, but I'll read it out. The life and strange, surprising adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York Mariner, who lived 28 years all alone in an uninhabited island on the coast of America near the mouth of the great river of Orinoco, having been cast on shore by shipwreck wherein all the men perished but himself, with an account of how he was at last as strangely delivered by pirates, written by himself. Does anyone know who did write Robinson Crusoe?
Daniel Defoe.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, not Robinson Crusoe. So it is not an autobiography. And in fact, Robinson Crusoe is an invented character, although he draws on some shipwreck stories. So what do you think about either this example or when authorship, what does authorship do when it's claiming that this is my own experience, or this is a true story, this is my autobiography? Fit into what we've been talking about.
It's meta-literary in a respect, because it's like it's making the process of writing part of the fiction, and vice versa. It's almost realising the fiction in that respect. But in a way, it's kind of just factually wrong, isn't it? Because it wasn't written by a character; it was written by a person. So I don't know if there's like a moral element to that, in that it's just incorrect.
Does it matter? Because I mean, if we're distancing ourselves from the author figure, it shouldn't matter who the hell we put on our books. We can just.
Yeah, so I can't think what that author's called who wrote the book American Dust, which has been quite controversial recently. Have you seen the controversy about that? She's a white American, a white US citizen, who's written a book about a Latina, perhaps a Mexican woman, trying to get across the wall into the border from Mexico into the US. And it's a kind of thriller, but it's also been used to sort of shine a light on that migrant experience and how desperate it can be. But there's been a huge controversy about whether she has the right to that story. In some ways, it's the opposite of the kind of autobiographical idea where you say, you know, my experience means I'm the person to write this story. What people are saying about, I can't even remember what her name is, which is obviously some cross mashup of Freud and Barthes in my own mind, that I've suppressed that. But the book's called American Dust, and it's been a really interesting controversy. Do you know, we're going to have to wrap up, because people aren't just, even though how fun this is for me and for us, perhaps it's not as good if you can't actually take part in the discussion. But maybe I would just say, what would we go on to do? I think we'd probably have some more of these kinds of examples, and maybe the argument, the discussion I would want to move into, I think, is maybe picking up what Jessie said, that there are ways in which the overthrow of the author seems a kind of progressive step. Barthes ends his essay by saying, the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. So, you know, this tyrant figure's got to be toppled so that we as individuals can kind of be creative and engage with texts. And that seems a very progressive thing, but I wonder what would happen then to the kind of contrary calls that we should be studying books written by a wider variety of authors, about sort of decolonizing the curriculum, Black authors, Black and minority ethnic authors, gay or queer or trans authors, women authors. Those are all progressive things about the literary, but they seem perhaps to rest on quite a regressive idea of authorship, and that's where I'd want to go, I think, in the next bit of the tutorial. It's been really great fun, and I hope that's just given you a taste of the way I guess we would try to work here at Hertford. Thanks a lot for tuning in to our online tutorial, and good luck with your applications, whatever you choose to do. Thank you. Bye.